"This house was never yours, Mom," Daniel said. His voice calm in a way that made the words land even colder than anger ever could. And Margaret Whitmore did not respond. Not immediately. Not even with a flicker of surprise on her face. Because at 71 years old she had learned that the most dangerous moments in life were not the loud ones, but the quiet ones that slipped in under the surface and rearranged everything you thought you understood about your own family. And the dining room that had once held decades of laughter and Sunday dinners now felt unfamiliar, as if the walls themselves had stepped back to watch what would happen next. The mahogany table stretching too wide between them, polished to a shine that reflected the soft yellow light overhead. A light that seemed too warm for the chill settling into Margaret's chest. And across from her Emily sat perfectly composed, her hands folded neatly beside her plate, her expression unreadable except for the faintest tightening at the corners of her lips, the kind of subtle shift Margaret might have missed years ago but could not ignore now. Not after everything. Not after the funeral that had ended just hours before, where she had stood beside a casket holding the man she had built her entire life with, a man who used to fill every room with quiet steadiness, who used to reach for her hand under this very table when conversations drifted too long, who used to say without hesitation that this house, every inch of it, was theirs, together. And now that voice was gone, replaced by the measured tone of a son who would not meet her eyes. Daniel's gaze fixed somewhere just past her shoulder as if looking directly at her required more effort than he was willing to give. And Margaret noticed the small things. The way his fingers tapped once against the table before going still. The way Emily's foot brushed lightly against his under the table as if reminding him of something. As if guiding him. And that was when Margaret felt it. Not grief. Not exactly. But something sharper. Something colder. The realization that the ground beneath her life had shifted without her noticing. That decisions had been made in quiet conversations she had not been part of. That plans had been set into motion while she was still setting the table. Still believing she was at the center of a family that now seemed to orbit around someone else entirely. And she drew in a slow breath. Steady. Controlled. The kind of breath that kept her voice from shaking when she finally spoke. "What do you mean, Daniel?" she asked, her tone even, almost gentle, as if she were asking about something ordinary, something that could be explained away with a simple misunderstanding. But Daniel exhaled, a short, impatient sound, and for the first time that evening he glanced at Emily before answering. Just a quick look, but enough for Margaret to see the silent exchange pass between them. And when he looked back at his mother there was something new in his expression, something distant, something decided. "It's in the paperwork," he said. And Margaret felt the words settle into place, heavy and deliberate, like pieces of a truth she had not yet fully seen, but was beginning, slowly, inevitably, to understand. Margaret did not ask another question that night because she already understood that whatever answer Daniel might give would not be meant to comfort her. And the rest of the evening passed in a silence that felt heavier than any argument. The kind of silence that settled into the corners of the house and stayed there long after the plates had been cleared and the lights had been dimmed. And when she finally climbed the stairs to the bedroom she had shared with her husband for over 40 years, each step felt unfamiliar. As if she were walking through someone else's home instead of her own. The carpet soft beneath her feet. The faint scent of his cologne still lingering in the air. A scent that had once been comforting but now only reminded her of how quickly everything had changed. And she paused at the doorway, her hand resting lightly against the frame, taking in the room as if seeing it for the first time. The neatly made bed. The reading lamp on his side still angled the way he liked it. The book he had been halfway through resting on the nightstand, its pages marked but unfinished, just like everything else he had left behind. And Margaret moved slowly, deliberately, setting her purse down on the dresser, smoothing the fabric of her dress as if the simple act of straightening it might bring some sense of order back into her life. But the feeling would not come, because beneath the quiet of the house there was something else now, something subtle but undeniable. a shift she could not ignore. And as she sat on the edge of the bed, she began to notice the small things that had changed over the past few weeks, things that had seemed insignificant at the time but now felt connected. The way Daniel had started coming by more often but staying for shorter visits. The way Emily had taken over conversations, answering questions that were not directed at her, steering discussions toward topics Margaret had no say in. The way certain papers had disappeared from the desk in the study, and then reappeared in different places, as if someone had been sorting through them without telling her. And Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to think, to gather the fragments of memory that were beginning to arrange themselves into something clearer, something more troubling, because she realized now that the distance she had felt from her son had not happened overnight. It had been building quietly, piece by piece, in polite conversations and small decisions that excluded her, in moments when Emily's voice carried just a little more authority than it should have, in the way Daniel had stopped asking for her opinion and started informing her of outcomes. Instead, and Margaret opened her eyes again, her gaze steady now, no longer searching but observing, because grief was still there, deep and heavy, but it was no longer the only thing she felt. There was something else rising alongside it, something sharper, something that demanded attention, and she stood up, walking toward the window that overlooked the front yard. The same yard she had tended for decades, where every tree and flower bed had been planted with intention and care, and she rested her hand against the cool glass, looking out at the darkened street, the quiet neighborhood that had once felt like a place of certainty. And for the first time she allowed herself to consider a possibility she had been avoiding, that the life she believed she understood had been quietly rewritten around her, and that the people she trusted most had already decided what her place in it would be. The next morning arrived quietly, without announcement, the pale light of early dawn slipping through the curtains and stretching across the bedroom floor. And Margaret was already awake, sitting upright against the headboard with her hands folded neatly in her lap, still dressed in the same clothes she had worn the night before, because sleep had not come, not even for a moment, her mind too steady, too alert, moving through every detail she had begun to piece together, and when she finally stood, her movements were slow but deliberate, as if each action had been decided long before her feet touched the floor, and she made her way downstairs, the house silent except for the soft creak of the stairs beneath her weight, a sound she had known for decades and yet now seemed sharper, more noticeable, like everything else in her life had become. And in the kitchen she paused again, taking in the familiar space, the coffee maker, the neatly arranged cabinets, the window above the sink that overlooked the backyard, and she reached for a mug without thinking, filling it with coffee that she did not immediately drink, instead holding it in both hands as the warmth settled into her palms, grounding her in the moment. And it was there, in that stillness, that she noticed something she had overlooked before. A stack of envelopes placed neatly at the edge of the counter, not where she usually kept her mail, but set aside, separated, as if someone had already gone through them. And Margaret set her mug down carefully, her fingers steady as she picked up the stack, flipping through the envelopes one by one, her name printed clearly on each of them, and yet several had already been opened, the edges torn cleanly, the contents slightly shifted, and she did not need to ask who had done it, because the answer was already forming in her mind, quiet and undeniable, and she moved to the dining room, laying the envelopes out across the table, smoothing them flat as she examined each one more closely, her eyes scanning dates, return addresses, small details that would have once meant nothing but now felt significant, and she noticed patterns, subtle at first, then clearer, certain statements missing, others arriving late, financial documents she vaguely remembered now altered in ways she could not immediately explain, and as she stood there, the realization did not come as a shock, but as a confirmation of something she had already begun to understand, that the changes in her life had not been accidental, that the distance she felt was not simply grief, but the result of decisions made without her knowledge. And she straightened, her posture firm, her expression calm, because there was no panic in her, no rush of emotion, only a growing clarity that settled into place with each passing second, and she carried the envelopes with her toward the study, the room her husband had always kept in perfect order, where every document had a place, where every detail had been accounted for. And as she stepped inside, she paused at the desk, her gaze moving slowly across its surface, noting what remained and what had been disturbed, the slight shift of a drawer that no longer closed as smoothly as it once had, the absence of a folder she distinctly remembered, and Margaret reached out, opening the drawer fully this time, her movements precise, methodical, as she began to search, not with urgency, but with purpose, because she understood now that whatever had been done carefully, quietly, and over time. And if there was one thing she knew after a lifetime of managing a household, it was that nothing careful and quiet happened without leaving a trace for someone patient enough to look. Margaret did not rush as she searched the desk because she knew that haste would only cloud what she was beginning to see with unsettling clarity, and instead, she moved with the same steady precision she had used for years when balancing household accounts or organizing tax records, lifting each folder, opening each drawer fully, noting not only what was present but what felt out of place. And it did not take long before the pattern became clearer. A thin folder tucked toward the back where it did not belong, its label slightly different from the rest, newer, less worn, as if it had been added recently rather than maintained over time, and Margaret pulled it free, her fingers pausing briefly against the cover before she opened it, not out of hesitation but out of recognition, because she already knew that whatever was inside would confirm what she had been quietly piecing together since the night before. And as she flipped through the pages, her eyes moved steadily across the text. Legal language she was not unfamiliar with but had never needed to question before. And there it was. Her name, her address, references to the house, to ownership, to transfers and authorizations that she did not remember signing, documents dated within the past year, during a time when her husband had still been alive but increasingly unwell, when decisions had been made quickly, when papers had been placed in front of her with reassuring explanations and little urgency to examine them closely, and Margaret felt no sudden surge of emotion, no shock, only a quiet, settling understanding that spread through her like a slow current, because the pieces now fit together too cleanly to ignore. The missing mail, the altered statements, the subtle shifts in behavior, the careful redirection of conversations, and she closed the folder gently, placing it back on the desk for a moment as she straightened, her gaze moving across the room once more, seeing it now not as it had been but as it was, a place that had been quietly reorganized without her knowledge. And she thought of Emily, of the way she had always presented herself as helpful, attentive, involved, stepping in at just the right moments, offering to handle things when Margaret was tired or distracted. And Margaret recalled the small, almost invisible ways authority had shifted, how Emily had begun answering questions before they were fully asked, how Daniel had deferred to her without realizing it, how decisions had been framed as temporary solutions that slowly became permanent changes. And Margaret reached for the folder again, holding it firmly this time, not as something fragile but as something solid, something real. Because whatever had been done had not been accidental. It had required planning, patience, and a belief that she would not notice until it was too late. And she turned, walking out of the study with measured steps, the folder held neatly at her side, her expression unchanged, calm and composed, because if there was one thing Margaret understood now, it was that reacting too quickly would only give away how much she knew. And for the first time since the funeral she allowed herself a single, quiet thought that settled into place with certainty, that whoever had assumed she would remain unaware had made a very careful mistake. Margaret did not confront Daniel or Emily that morning because she understood that truth, once revealed too quickly, could be easily denied or reshaped, and instead she returned the folder to the desk exactly as she had found it, aligning it carefully with the other documents so that nothing appeared disturbed, her movements precise, intentional, as if she were restoring a scene rather than uncovering it. And when she stepped back into the kitchen, she resumed the quiet rhythm of her morning, rinsing her cup, placing it in the sink, wiping down the counter with slow, even strokes, each action measured not out of habit alone but out of control, because control was something she realized had been gradually taken from her in ways so subtle she had mistaken them for care, for help, for concern. And now that she saw it clearly, she knew she could not afford to lose any more of it. And by the time Daniel and Emily came downstairs, she was seated at the table with a fresh cup of coffee, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, the same as it had always been. And when Daniel greeted her, his voice carried a note of caution, as if he were testing the air for any sign of change. But Margaret simply nodded, offering a small, polite smile that revealed nothing. And Emily watched her closely, just for a moment longer than necessary, her eyes searching for something beneath the surface, something that was no longer there. Because Margaret had already learned that the safest place to keep the truth was behind stillness, and breakfast passed in quiet conversation, ordinary topics spoken in ordinary tones, plans for the week, errands to run, small details that filled the space without meaning anything at all. And Margaret listened, not as a participant but as an observer, noting the way Emily answered questions directed at Daniel, the way Daniel deferred without realizing it, the way decisions were phrased as if they had already been agreed upon. And when Emily mentioned scheduling an appointment with a real estate agent, her voice light, almost casual, Margaret did not react. Not outwardly, though the words settled firmly into place alongside everything else she had uncovered, confirming what she had already begun to understand. And she simply set her cup down and said that she would be stepping out later, her tone calm, leaving no room for objection. And neither Daniel nor Emily questioned her, perhaps because they believed there was nothing to question, that she remained unaware, that the quiet woman sitting across from them was still the same person they had slowly pushed to the edges of her own life. And Margaret let them believe it, because belief, she realized, was something that could be used just as easily as it could be taken. And when she left the house that morning, she did not hurry, closing the front door behind her with the same gentle care she always had, walking down the familiar path to her car, the air cool against her face, the neighborhood unchanged in its appearance, though everything within her had shifted. And as she drove away, she did not look back, not because she felt no attachment to the home she had built, but because she understood that what mattered now was not what had been taken, but what could still be reclaimed. And for the first time since the quiet unraveling had begun, Margaret Whitmore was no longer trying to understand what had happened. She was beginning to decide what would happen next. Margaret drove with steady hands, the road ahead stretching out in quiet familiarity, each turn and stoplight part of a routine she had followed for years. Yet today every mile felt different because she was no longer moving through her life without question. She was moving with intention. And when she pulled into the small parking lot of a modest brick office building just off Main Street, she turned off the engine and sat for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as she looked at the name on the sign near the entrance, Harris & Cole Legal Services, a name she had not needed in years but had never forgotten. And after a brief pause, she stepped out of the car, smoothing her coat as she walked toward the door, her posture straight, her expression calm, because this was not a visit driven by panic or confusion, it was a decision. And inside the office the air was quiet, the faint scent of paper and polished wood familiar in a way that felt grounding. And when the receptionist greeted her, Margaret gave her name with a steady voice. And it was not long before she was shown into a private office where an older man stood as she entered. His face lined with age but his eyes sharp with recognition. "Margaret Whitmore," he said, his tone warm but measured, and she nodded, offering a small, polite smile as she took the seat across from him. And for a moment neither of them spoke, Because some conversations did not require an immediate beginning, they carried their own weight into the room. And finally Margaret placed her hands neatly in her lap and said, "I need to understand something." Her voice even, without urgency. And Mr. Harris inclined his head slightly, listening. And as she spoke she did not accuse. She did not speculate. She simply described what she had seen. The documents, the dates, the signatures that did not feel like her own, the changes that had taken place without her full awareness. And Mr. Harris listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful, his fingers resting lightly against the desk as he considered each detail. And when she finished he did not respond immediately, instead reaching for a folder from a nearby cabinet, one that appeared older, well-handled, its edges softened by time, and he placed it carefully on the desk between them, opening it with deliberate care. And Margaret leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady as she followed his movements, and he turned the pages one by one, stopping at a document that he rotated gently toward her. "This," he said, his voice calm, "is the original property agreement your husband filed." And Margaret looked down at the paper, her eyes moving across the familiar lines, the signatures she recognized, the language she understood. And there it was, clear and unambiguous, ownership shared, protected, secured in a way that left no room for doubt. And Margaret did not react outwardly, but something settled firmly within her. A quiet confirmation that what she had begun to suspect was not only possible, but real. And she lifted her gaze to meet Mr. Harris's, her expression unchanged, composed, and he studied her for a moment before speaking again, his tone careful. "If there have been changes to this, they would require very specific authorization." And Margaret gave a small nod, absorbing the words not as a revelation but as a final piece of clarity. And when she spoke again her voice was just as steady as before. "Then I would like to see every version that came after this one." And there was no hesitation in her request. No uncertainty, only quiet resolve. And Mr. Harris inclined his head once more, understanding not only what she was asking, but why. And as he turned to retrieve additional files Margaret sat back in her chair, her hands resting calmly against her lap, because whatever had been done in silence was no longer hidden from her. And for the first time since everything had begun to unravel, she was no longer searching for answers, she was preparing to use them. Margaret did not leave the office immediately after reviewing the documents because she understood that what she did next mattered more than what she had already discovered, and she remained seated as Mr. Harris placed additional files in front of her, each one representing a step in a process that had been carried out without her full awareness. And as she examined them her eyes moved steadily across the pages, noting the progression, the subtle shifts in language, the signatures that appeared increasingly inconsistent, the dates that aligned too conveniently with moments when her attention had been elsewhere. And she did not interrupt, did not question aloud, because the answers were already present in the details, waiting only for someone patient enough to recognize them. And when she finally looked up her expression remained composed, but there was a firmness there now, something settled and unshakable, and she asked for copies. Not hurriedly, not with urgency, but with quiet certainty. And Mr. Harris nodded, understanding the weight of that request. And as he prepared the documents Margaret sat back, her hands resting lightly against her lap, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested calm but concealed something far more deliberate. Because she was no longer reacting to what had been done, she was deciding how it would end. And when she left the office she carried the folder with her, held neatly against her side, not as evidence to be revealed immediately, but as something to be used at the right moment. And the drive home felt shorter, not because the distance had changed, but because her purpose had. And when she stepped through the front door the house greeted her with the same quiet stillness as before. But this time it did not feel uncertain, felt observed, as if she were seeing it clearly for the first time in weeks. And she placed her keys down in their usual spot, setting the folder on the entry table for just a moment before picking it up again and walking toward the study, where she returned it to the drawer, positioning it exactly as she had found it earlier that morning, because nothing about her actions could suggest that anything had changed. And when Daniel and Emily returned later that afternoon, Margaret was in the living room, seated comfortably with a book in her hands, her posture relaxed, her expression neutral, and she looked up just long enough to greet them with the same quiet politeness she had always shown. And Emily watched her closely again, her gaze lingering for a fraction longer than necessary, as if searching for something beneath the surface. But Margaret gave her nothing. No hesitation. No sign. Only the calm presence of someone who appeared exactly as she had always been. And the evening unfolded in its usual rhythm. Dinner prepared. Dishes cleared. Small conversations exchanged. But Margaret was no longer part of it in the same way. She was observing, listening, noting every word, every glance, every subtle shift in tone. And when Daniel spoke about future plans for the house, about renovations, about changes that would make it more suitable for their needs, Margaret did not interrupt, did not question. She simply nodded once, as if acknowledging something already decided. And that was when Emily's expression shifted slightly, just for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face before it was quickly hidden. And Margaret noticed it, just as she noticed everything now, and she returned her attention to her plate, her movements unhurried, her demeanor unchanged, because she understood something they did not, that the strongest position was not the one that spoke first, but the one that waited. And as the night settled into silence once more, Margaret rose from the table, placing her napkin down neatly before walking out of the room without a word, leaving behind a space that felt different, not because anything had been said, but because something had shifted, something quiet and irreversible. And upstairs, as she stood once again in the room she had shared with her husband, Margaret allowed herself a single, steady breath, not of relief, but of certainty, because she knew now that whatever had been taken from her would not remain that way for long. The following morning Margaret moved through the house with the same quiet rhythm she had maintained for days, but there was a difference now, something subtle yet unmistakable in the way she carried herself, as if each step had been measured in advance, as if every action had already been decided before it happened. And when Daniel and Emily came downstairs, they found her at the dining table once again, her hands resting neatly around a cup of coffee, her posture composed, her expression calm, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, because there was something in the air that felt different, something that did not belong to routine. And Margaret was the one who broke the silence, her voice steady, almost gentle, as she said, "I would like us to sit down together this evening." And she did not explain further, did not elaborate, only offered a small, polite nod before returning her attention to her cup. And Daniel hesitated, his brow tightening slightly as if trying to understand what had shifted, while Emily's gaze lingered on Margaret just a moment longer, her expression unreadable. But neither of them questioned it. And the rest of the day passed quietly, each hour unfolding with an almost deliberate calm, as if the house itself were waiting. And when evening arrived, Margaret prepared dinner as she always had, setting the table with care, placing each plate, each utensil in its proper place, the same ritual she had followed for decades. But this time there was no uncertainty in her movements, no hesitation, only quiet precision. And when Daniel and Emily sat down across from her, the room felt still, the soft hum of the overhead light the only sound that filled the space between them. And Margaret did not rush, did not begin immediately. She allowed the silence to settle, to stretch just long enough to be noticed, and then she reached for the folder she had placed beside her chair, lifting it calmly onto the table, her fingers resting lightly on its surface. And Daniel's gaze shifted to it at once, confusion flickering across his face, while Emily's posture straightened ever so slightly, her attention sharpening. And Margaret opened the folder without a word, turning it so that both of them could see. The documents laid out neatly, organized, undeniable, and she did not accuse, did not raise her voice. She simply said, "I spent some time reviewing these today." Her tone even, as if discussing something routine, and Daniel leaned forward, his expression tightening as he scanned the pages, while Emily remained still, her face composed but her eyes fixed on the documents, and Margaret continued, her voice calm. "These are the original records, and these are the versions that came after." And she paused, allowing the difference to speak for itself, the inconsistencies clear without explanation, the alterations impossible to overlook. And for the first time Daniel looked directly at his mother, uncertainty breaking through the distance he had held for so long. And Margaret met his gaze without hesitation, without anger, only with quiet clarity, because she understood that the moment did not require force. It required truth, and truth, when presented without emotion, had a way of settling into place where denial could not easily reach. And she closed the folder gently, her hands resting on top of it as she added, "I think it would be best if we addressed this properly." And there was no threat in her voice, no demand, only a certainty that left no room for dismissal. And the silence that followed was different from before, no longer empty, but filled with something heavier, something final. And Margaret did not wait for a response. She simply rose from her chair with the same calm composure, leaving the folder on the table between them, and walked out of the room, her steps steady, her posture unchanged, because she knew that everything that needed to be said had already been placed exactly where it belonged. Daniel did not follow Margaret immediately after she left the dining room, because he remained seated, his hands still resting on the table as his eyes moved slowly across the documents she had placed in front of him, and the silence between him and Emily felt heavier now, no longer comfortable or controlled, but strained, uncertain. And Emily was the first to move, reaching for the top page with careful fingers, her expression composed but tighter than before, her eyes scanning the lines with a focus that revealed more than her silence ever could. And Daniel watched her, not speaking, not interrupting, because for the first time he was not looking past what was in front of him. He was seeing it, and the pieces that had once felt distant and unclear were beginning to settle into place with a clarity that left little room for explanation. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, stripped of the confidence he had carried so easily just days ago. "Emily," he said, and her name lingered in the air, unanswered for a moment longer than it should have. And when she looked up, her expression was still controlled, but there was something else beneath it now, something that could not be smoothed over as easily as before. And upstairs Margaret stood near the window, her gaze steady as she looked out over the yard, the evening light fading slowly into night. And she did not listen for raised voices, did not wait for confrontation, because she knew that whatever was happening downstairs no longer required her presence. And after a few minutes she turned away from the window and moved toward the dresser, opening the top drawer and removing a small, neatly organized set of papers she had kept separate from everything else, documents that had remained untouched, secured in a way that did not rely on anyone else's understanding or approval. And she placed them carefully into a folder of her own, closing it with quiet precision before setting it aside. And when she returned downstairs later, the house had changed in a way that was not immediately visible but deeply felt. Daniel stood near the table, his posture uncertain, his expression unsettled, while Emily remained seated, her composure intact but her silence heavier. And Margaret did not ask what had been said, did not demand an explanation. She simply walked into the room with the same calm presence she had carried all day, her steps steady, her gaze clear. And she picked up the folder from the table, holding it lightly in her hands as she looked at Daniel, not with accusation, not with anger, but with a quiet finality that left no space for misunderstanding. And when she spoke, her voice was as even as it had been from the beginning. "I will be meeting with Mr. Harris again tomorrow. she said. And Daniel's expression shifted, something like realization settling in as he nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and Margaret inclined her head slightly, as if confirming something already decided, before turning away, and she walked toward the front of the house, her hand resting briefly on the back of a chair she had polished countless times over the years, her fingers brushing against the surface as if marking the moment without holding on to it. And when she reached the doorway she paused just long enough to glance back, not at the people in the room, but at the space itself, the home she had built, the place that had been quietly taken from her piece by piece, and now stood exactly where it had always been, unchanged in its structure but no longer uncertain in its ownership, and she stepped forward, leaving the room behind with a calm that did not need to be explained, because she understood something they did not. That control had never truly left her hands, it had only been assumed to be gone, and assumptions, once proven wrong, had a way of collapsing all at once, leaving behind nothing but the truth that had been there. From the very beginning.